All right, well, today we are back to work on the C6 competition drift car build. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this project, basically this is kind of my in-game competition drift car build. I've been competing for a while in a Miata with 500 horsepower, and it was competitive, but we were severely outgunned a lot of times, you know, and we made it work, but we want to have a car that we're not going to be outgunned in. So we're building this thing as kind of the end-all be-all competition drift car for me. You know, everything I'd ever want to do to a competition drift car, we are going to be doing to this car. I mean, built motor, dry sump, race trans, all PDM wiring. It's very thorough. It should be a very rowdy, very competitive build, but as you can see, there's a lot to do. So we had a little debacle with the first chassis we got that was already kind of half built. That's a whole nother story, but we ended up picking up this steel chassis, getting it caged. We got it back, we got it cleaned out, and now it is time to prep this thing for our transmission setup and everything, and then paint it. So that's what we're working on. We need to get this thing off the trailer in the garage, start cutting, start hacking, and then start painting. So ideally by the end of this, the chassis will be ready to start accepting the parts from the other car, so we can pull everything off it, put everything on this car, get our engine back in, start building our turbo kit, and just hammer down, try to get this thing done in about a month and a half. So tight time crunch, but I think we can do it if we keep our heads down and we don't get any major parts delays. But first, we gotta get this thing ready to build in the first place. So let's get it off the trailer and get to it. Are we ready for that?
Give it a whirl. Let's try it out. If not, we can do the same setup, I think, with the pallet on the bottom. Drag his ass home!
All right, well, we managed to get this thing off the trailer and in here, not without a fight. Hey, if you don't have a forklift, but you got a lawnmower, you're halfway there. I mean, it worked. That mower has put in some work moving some vehicles. I'm glad we were able to get it off, have it in here, and we can finally really dive into it. Working on it in the shop's a struggle because we don't have electrical in the shop yet because we're waiting on a permit for that. So no lights, you've only got daylight. So to have it in the garage where all the tools are, it's time to hammer down. So what we're working on first is cutting this thing up. So we might end up cutting all these wheel tubs and everything out and taking that out entirely. I'm not sure. We're gonna start slow, cut back here, and then see what we're left with. We have this carbon fiber rear firewall to go in. We're gonna have a rear mount radiator and all this stuff. So there's a lot of things that are gonna kind of depend on all of that stuff. The other car, all of this is cut out. So we really just need to kind of sneak up on it and see. We also need to prep the trans tunnel. So we've got to cut out a lot, pretty much the whole top of the trans tunnel, to make room for our front transmission because we're moving the transmission from the back to the front using a Race Trans 4-speed dog box. And we've got to cut out some of this bracing here. So I'd like to do all of this, obviously, before we paint the car so we're not cutting and grinding after we paint the chassis. So that's step one. Enough jibber jabber. Let's get to work. So we got straight to work cutting this thing up. Now, again, the plan here was to start small and see how much we could leave because we didn't have that option with the other car. We weren't able to see what it was like with half the fender arch or anything like that. So So we wanted to cut just this rear section off where the bash bar is going to be and see if we could weave the rest so we have protection, that wheel tub, from anything that could come off the tire. We'd also have the structure there to hold the front of the fender, and then the bash bar would hold the rear. So if we grazed a wall or something, the bash bar and the back of the quarter would kind of soak that up and we wouldn't get into this structure here. So we tried to trim it down, make it as slim as possible, but we realized with the way our rear firewall is that we have to go in, we weren't going to be able to save any of it. It's not meant to fit over top of the factory stuff. So we started taking this halo trim piece off and then started working on cutting that section up. So this was a little more elaborate. The cut needed to be a little more precise because that carbon firewall fits kind of right over top of the fiberglass here. So we needed to get a nice, clean, precise cut all the way down and then try to cut these arches out. Now this is tricky. These cars are built with panel bond, and that's about it. Like the fiberglass, the way they attach it is just panel bond. So there's a lot of places where it's tough to get to. So getting that one off, that one is the one from the hit where this car had been hit, when it was a complete car. So it was already pretty broken up. It was pretty easy to pull that one off. But this side, we're trying to scrape the panel bond from behind and leave all the metal structure, but it was not going very smoothly. It was a bit of a struggle because you start bending the metal, and we managed to persevere. We got it off, and then wanted to get this last bit of fiberglass off the back, this little rear shelf area. That came off pretty easy, and we were pretty well done with stripping the car as far as the fiberglass part is concerned. All right, well, we got this thing most of the way to a completely naked shell. We need to get these rocker panels off. So they are glued in, but luckily the ones on the other car are not glued in yet. They're either replacements or I don't know. Somehow they got them out without destroying them. So we can just destroy these to get them out. They're both already pretty toast. So we need to get those off, and then we need to do some more cutting. So we need to cut the rear off. That's going to be a little tricky to get it perfect to reuse the bash bars off the other car because, even if we're a 1/4 inch off, then the quick latches going to the hatch aren't going to line up. And kind of the same deal with the front here. We need to cut a little more off the front. We need to make it straight, and we need to make it match the other car, and then we'll have to weld plates in here. But the big thing I want to start on is prepping the tunnel for the front Tran setup. So we got a good bit to cut out. We learned a lot from cutting it out of the other car, and I think we can do it better for this car. We also have my GSR 4-speed dog box came in. The one I borrowed had a 24-inch setback, so it put the shifter up here. So I got a 26-inch, which is gonna put it right about in the factory shifter hole area. So I'll have to show you guys that later. But what that means is we won't have to cut out as much forward as we did last time. So we, kind of got a trial run with the other car. Hopefully we can make it nicer with this car. The reason I did that is because I want to put myself in the seat and my pedals and my column. I want to put myself as far back in the car as possible for weight distribution. Since we're going to have a pedal box and an aftermarket column, we can afford to do that. So yeah, so just more chassis prep. Oh, so the reason we cut all this off, we wanted to save these tubs as we talked about earlier. The problem is the carbon rear firewall basically slides over here. So there was no way to do it and keep those tubs. It's a HGK firewall. They make a carbon rear tub. If we decide to, if it's a problem having the arches open, then we can go to the carbon fiber tubs if we need to. I mean, I prefer not to. They're a little pricey, but we have options is the point. But we debated on it. We thought about building our own firewall, but for time's sake and complication, using the one we literally already have that came with the other car that's perfect to fit this seemed like the best move. So that's what we're gonna do. Whole lot of jibber jabber. We need to get back to work. Start cutting and grinding and smashing some fiberglass. The usual. So I had actually finally got another plasma cutter. I sold my original one with my welding cart setup because it was built into the welding cart. This is another cheap sub $200 Amazon one. I actually like it a little better because of the consumable style, and it comes with a little stand, which wasn't working great in this scenario, but it is nice to have. So we started cutting it out, trying to do it nice, get it in one cut. I had traced out where we needed to cut kind of based on what I saw from the other car. It was definitely being a bit of a struggle. Just some of it was harder to get to than I thought because I'm kind of reaching around the cage bar and so on and so forth. So then I start trying to hammer it out, and I'm like, it's got to be cut enough. But then it didn't seem like it was, so I kept getting little areas where the plasma cutter might not have gone all the way through, and this starts a pretty big struggle thinking that I just didn't cut it all the way through, and I'm wondering because I'm hitting this thing hard, and it is just not popping out. It's not even trying to pop out. Well, what I didn't realize was the bracing that I have to cut out underneath has a kind of a piece of angle that comes up and attaches to this plate. So I got under there and cut that with the plasma cutter, started hammering. We were making some progress, but now it's kind of wedged. So I got under there and cut it some more after we pried and pried and pried. And after a bit of finagling, both me and Josue from the top and from the bottom, we were able to finally get the last bit of it cut out and it broken free and knock it out into oblivion. So then we worked on cutting out the rearward section. We're doing it in 2 steps, the front part that needs clearance and then the back part that needs clearance for the shifter. So we got that cut out of the way. That's how it was supposed to go. First, and the other part, didn't realize there was that bracing under there on that part. So then it's time to start trying to clean up the edges. Now this is always more difficult than it seems. My hope is that I can come in here and just make these edges perfect, but the plasma cutter, especially if you don't have a perfect hand while you're doing it, it leaves a lot of rough edges and it leaves a lot of slag and stuff in general. So we spend a good bit of time grinding on this thing with the little die grinder, then we go to the big flap wheel and just try to shape it up. Now that I didn't do great on the original cut and the original trace, there's the left and right side of the main cutout aren't quite even, so trying to grind those back, shape them up, and just get everything cleaned up since I know we'll have to weld to it. And then it was time to move to the bracing underneath. So my plan was to do this all right and drill out all the spot welds and then just have to make a cut right at the front of the tunnel and bring these out completely because it's basically kind of a double U with bracing in between. So we started drilling out spot welds and we got through about 5, 6 of them and realized that was just not feasible. It's going to take us all day, if not more. So we just cut them out with the plasma cutter and came back and cleaned them up. Well, we're going to cut the rear off so we can put our bash bar from the other car on this car. Now this is tricky because the frame rail's angled down, but we need to have the angle basically square with the ground. 2, we're going to cut it with a Sawzall. I've debated all my options: grinder, Sawzall, plasma cutter. I think this is our best option. I'm going to try to cut it a little long. We can always grind it back. You know, I would prefer to keep the grinding it back to a minimum, but if we have to, we have to. Better than we can't grow new material. I mean, we kind of can. We can add a bunch of plates, but we'll see what happens. So we started cutting this thing with the Sawzall. Now the tricky part about cutting something boxed like this with a Sawzall is you can be dead straight on one side, but the blade kind of catch an edge and start pulling on the other side, and the other half of the cut be super crooked. So I had Josue keep an eye on it while I was doing it. We tried to cut them as straight as possible, but inevitably they're not perfectly straight. So we had to do some work with the grinder, get them ground flat. We'll have to do some more later as well. You know, just a little foreshadowing. But we get them cleaned up. We get the area around them cleaned up since we're going to have to weld to them, and we are done. Check it out. Here's where we're at. We've got this thing pretty much as stripped as it's going to get. The only thing missing is pulling the rockers off. Past that, we're not taking it apart anymore. We're going to essentially start assembling. So I'm honestly really excited. Having this thing to this point, it's really cool because the other car was always kind of this weird, it was just kind of jumping back and forth. You know, it started with, oh, they're going to change the engine and do a built stock trans and then front trans and then keeping the engine, and then we ended up, you know, I did all this trans tunnel cutting on that car with the engine still in it because I didn't plan on taking the engine out, but then we ended up having to take the engine out, and then we ended up with this car that was pretty much a bare shell, no wiring, no plumbing, no engine, no drivetrain, but we're still kind of working with work that was already done. So to have this car caged how I want it, set up how I want it, and to be starting from a clean slate, building this car from a bare chassis, it's exciting. I mean, it's a bummer that it's going to take more time and it's going to delay us, but this build kind of snowballed into, again, being my in-game car, being everything I wanted it to be. You know, as time went on, I invested more and more into making it as nice as I possibly could. Instead of just doing it decent, trying to do it, you know, to the best of my ability, all really high quality parts and so on and so forth. So it always kind of felt weird doing that to kind of a hacked and haggard chassis. So to be able to start from scratch with a chassis and build it from the ground up, it feels good. It feels good. So you can see the tunnel here. So basically we cut this ribbing out. It just goes back to there. We started to drill the spot welds out. I wanted to take out all of it because you're left with like the center section, but it was taking a long time. Drilling spot welds is not fun. So we ended up just plasma cutting it, grinding it down smooth. we've got plenty of room. We've got a lot more room here than we did with the other car. So the other car, I cut out a relief down here for the trans, but once we got the trans in and said and done, I realized I really didn't need to. So I'm hoping we can just do some heavy hammering in these areas, pretty much where this brace for the dash bar used to be, and get enough clearance to get the trans in and not have to cut any more of the tunnel out than this. Now, we're obviously gonna have to build a new tunnel on top of this, but we can't really do that until the trans is in. We can't really put the trans in until the engine's in. So we are gonna end up painting the chassis, having to do some grinding and some repainting, and it sucks to do it that way. The ideal way is really to dry build the car, build the whole thing, get all your welding and cutting and grinding and fitting done, take it completely back apart to this point, then paint it, because then you're not going to be changing anything. But we don't have the luxury of that much time. We're still on a time crunch trying to get this thing done, so we're going to have to do some steps and go backwards, but that's part of it. So, like I said, I'm excited, man. Should be a nice piece when we're all said and done with it. So, whole lot of jibber jabber to say. It's time to get back to work. We need to start making rear plates. We're gonna have to do the same for the front. So we whipped out the cardboard aided design and traced our frame rail over onto the cardboard. Now with tracing, it can be a little tricky because, you know, if you go on the outside of the line every time you trace it, it's just gonna grow and grow and grow. So when I cut them out of the cardboard, I try to cut them on the inside of the line and kind of do the same thing when we're going to cut them out of the steel. And it's important, obviously, also to mark them, not just which side's which, but which side's out, in, up, down, because it's not a completely symmetrical curvature. So we take a look at it, kind of need to trim just a little bit more on that one, but this one's solid. That one's literally perfect. Let's take it out. Yeah, I agree. It's a good one. So now it's time to transfer our template onto the steel plate. Now I noticed if I did them sideways, it was a lot more cutting, a lot of wasted material, but if I did them this way, you know, we're maximizing the material, but they were gonna be a little short. So I eyeballed it a bit and it seemed like it would pan out okay, to where it should still fill the hole completely. So we went ahead and started cutting them out. It takes a while to cut through this 1/4 inch plate on the bandsaw, but we got them cut out, and then it was time to grind away, get the corners ground down, get the shape finalized. I always do kind of the rough cut on the bandsaw and then try to finalize the shape in the belt grinder just because you can sneak up on it a little more. So then we switch to our Scotch-Brite belt. I like using this one for cleaning up the edges, cleaning up the surfaces. These had a lot of mill scale on them. I cleaned them down to bare metal when I was using this as a temporary welding table, which of course made it rust like crazy. So now we got to clean the rust off and the mill scale, but we get all that done and they're ready to go. All right, here's what we've got for plates. Do I have this the right way? It's this way. Yeah. Pretty much perfect. So we're trying to decide exactly how I want to do this. This is going to be a little too thick based on our measurements, how we cut it before. The only goal with keeping it the same as the other car is the stanchions that go up for the hatch, but I feel like we're probably going to have to modify that stuff anyway. The other thing is I didn't really intend to use 1/4 inch plate. This is pretty hefty for what we're doing here. Really, we need like 3/16. This is only like 1/8 inch, but this is all I had that was big enough. I have flat bar and stuff, but the widest is 3 inch. So yeah, but before we even think about tacking or welding these in, we need to get get the bash bar off the other car, mark and drill our holes, get nuts on the backside, weld them on. So yeah, we got them fitted good. Now it's just time to get ready to weld them on. Now we could pocket them and recess them in here, and we might have to do that, but we'll need to get an idea once we get the bash bar off and get it over here. So let's do that. Now it was time to start digging into the old car. I was trying to delay this as long as I could, make sure we were really happy with the other chassis before we did this, but it was time. We couldn't wait any longer. We'd taken some stuff off just to get an idea, but now it's time to strip it. So pulled the bash bar off. It came off pretty easy. And then we decided to get the fuel cell off as well, so we could see where we wanted to mount that in the other car, if we wanted to put it in the same spot, so on and so forth. The problem was the hatch was propped up by this ramp on the fuel cell, and there was really nowhere else to prop it up, so then we had to take the hatch off too, which realistically we needed the hatch anyway to make sure we put the bash bar in the right spot. So pulling off the bash bar kind of turned into a rabbit hole of pulling parts off this car. And the way they had attached this hatch, man, there's a plate and they didn't use the plate. They just through bolted it through the fiberglass. probably would not have lasted long. So we got that off, worked on getting the fuel cell off. This thing was wedged in here tight, dude. It took us a bunch of jiggling, but we finally got it out. All right, we got the bash bar taken off the other car. We also got the fuel cell out. We're gonna decide, I don't know if we're gonna keep it all the way in the back like it was before. Couple reasons. One, it's in the crash zone. Two, there's a lot of weight behind the axle, which is good for distribution, but kind of bad for overall balance. I'm gonna see if we can fit it up here, but we're not worried about that right this second. We need to get this bash bar mounted. So unfortunately, it's a little different than these frame rails. So my plan was to just, weld these on with nuts and bolt it on, but we're gonna have to go ahead and chop it off the plate, get everything matched up, get the plates matched up with the nuts and all that stuff, and then position the bash bar and weld the bash bar to these plates, which are gonna bolt to these plates. So a little more involved. Still not as bad as having to remake the whole thing, so I'm not complaining. But yeah, so I guess we'll get to cutting, grinding. So our cutting method of choice for this was the Sawzall as well. I just figured I could get as close to a straight cut with that as possible. So it was moving around on us a lot, so we went ahead and clamped it down. Luckily, we have this fixture table and we're able to clamp it down. So we get the first plate cut off, reposition it for the second plate. So the goal here is to retain as much material as possible. That way we have more room to work with. Now, our frame rails with the 1/4-inch plate are going to be a little longer than they were on the other car, so we can afford for this to shrink a little bit, for this to get a little bit shorter, but not by much. So we're trying to be careful. I went with the flat disc on the grinder just to try to level them out a little bit. But they still need to be a little unlevel to match the cut, so it's a balance there. And then started working on cleaning up the tubes. Since we're going to have to weld to them, I wanted to get all the rust cleaned off with the die grinder just to make sure we had some nice clean metal to weld to. So from there, while Josue was working on drilling holes in the 1/4-inch plates for me to weld the nuts behind, I went ahead and started working on getting an idea of where I wanted to put the fuel cell. Now, this thing was so tight in this box. I tried and tried to get it out. I had Josue help me. It was not happening. So I ended up having to cut this box apart that they had built just to get the fuel cell out. They must have built it around the fuel cell. I don't really understand how they got it in there otherwise. It was, even with the bar cut on both sides, we still had to pry it out. But once it was out, we started mocking it up in position to see if we could mount it up here, basically ahead of the radiator. This would keep it more center and keep it away from being one of the first things to be damaged in a wreck. Now, there are these two little tabs that were keeping us from having it all the way forward and drop down a little bit. So I went ahead and cut those two tabs out just to see where we could put it. Now, the quick change, we don't know exactly where that's going to be, so we can't mount it yet. So we moved back to working on the bash bar. Josue got one of the plates drilled, so I got the nuts and bolts through, tried to get them as center with as much slack as possible, and then went to weld them to the plate. Now, I wanted to TIG weld them, but it was not happy. It was not having it. I've welded zinc plated stuff before and it spits and sputters, but it was literally exploding little pieces of the flange of the nut and back into the tungsten and balling up the tungsten. It was an absolute mess. I came back with the MIG welder and got them all tacked in good. We don't want these to spin. All right, we got our two plates done to weld in. We got our, still spicy. Still spicy. We got our nuts welded in nice and center in the holes. Everything lines up with the plates. It's definitely the best way to do it to make sure everything lined up and was happy. And we'll be able to better kind of match the bash bar, because we might have a degree more or less angle on our cuts here. So all of that kind of becomes a factor. I'm gonna clean those up a little more. It's a little high on this side. It's tough when you just kind of eyeball it and grind some. That side's good. So anyway, back to it. So we got our plates in position and got them tacked in on both sides. So we wanted to make sure the tacks were good and strong and everything was going to hold. And then we went ahead and bolted the plates on. That way we could get the bash bar in position, mock it up, make sure everything was going to line up and be happy. We're going to be able to get the bolts in and out, so on and so forth. So after we checked that, it was time to burn them in. Now, so welding these out went pretty smooth. I have this Fronius Tran Steel 2200 I got not too long ago to replace the MIG I had for a while, and it just makes it a treat to MIG weld. The auto settings are so nice. It just welds so smooth. Welding on your back's never fun, but in general, had a good time welding this. It was a lot of fun. It's been a while since I've done a heavy amount of MIG welding. So anyway, we went ahead and got the brackets back in for the hatch because we wanted to put the hatch on before we put the bash bar on so that we could try to get everything lined up together. This is a hatch off the blue car. It has quick latches in the back that land on the bash bar. So figuring out how to position the bash bar to weld it was a struggle. So we got it into the hatch and we started, and things didn't seem right. It was not coming close to lining up. We couldn't get the bash bar far forward on the passenger side. We're like, what is going on here? But it was just the adjustment at the top. So we used the trim piece at the top on the halo to basically make sure the hatch was level, and then we were about ready to weld it. All right, well, we got the plates welded onto the chassis. They welded pretty good. Got the plates bolted to there. We've got the bash bar in position, so it has these quick latches on the hatch. So basically what we've been doing is getting that hatch right front to back, because the brackets up there have some adjustment, getting it left to right, and getting the angle right by matching it on the halo there. So it's pretty close. That side's good. This side needs to come up a touch, but just with where the jack is, it wants to do one side or the other. So we're gonna give it a couple tacks on that side and then jack up this side, get it where it needs to be, tack that, make sure it's all still good. If it is, then we'll weld. Lots of finagling. I think probably about there is right. Looks pretty matched on this side. Looks pretty matched down there. So now that we had mocked it up in position, got it tacked in the exact place it needed to be to have everything line up, we could confidently weld it out. So we decided to do this all with MIG. I knew it would be a whole lot easier to get the tacks done, which was going to be a challenge in the first place, MIG or TIG, to do it with MIG. So we just decided to MIG weld the whole thing. Also, it was dirty and rusty and so on and so forth. So it was a fun project because I haven't MIG welded something like this in a while. I don't use MIG welding that much just because I'm on a production line, I'm not building a ton of stuff. So for me, I just like to TIG stuff. But in this scenario, we MIG'd it, and it was a fun little project. So once we got it welded, I went back with the wire wheel just to clean up kind of some of the nastiness, you know, and just get it back to shiny, bright metal, and then we could check it out. All right, bash bar welded to the plates. Welds came out pretty mediocre, I'll be honest. I always talk crap about how easy MIG is. I think that's the first time I've ever made something like this, like 2 bars close together, going around. I had to do it from far away because this was in the way. Not making excuses, just that's the first time I've really had a challenging position on a MIG. Otherwise, it's pretty easy. I mean, I guess this stuff didn't come out great either, so I can't really talk crap. Need to brush up on my MIG skills. Downhill is always kind of tough. The top here, I had to do the tack mode just because basically the edge was exposed, and whenever you have an edge and you're welding against an edge, you know, this is thick to thin. This is 1/4 inch to like 1/8 inch. That's fine here, but on top of that, when you're up here and you have just the edge, it just wants to melt away because the heat goes right into the edge instead of soaking into the whole piece. So anyway, jibber jabber. These are welded on, bash bar's done. We need to put it back on, just make sure it all fits, but we are gonna take it back off. Ospo it like Josue did with the cage. I'll clean it up like that. We're gonna do that the front and rear, and we'll probably just paint the bash bars when we paint the cage. Just paint them all the same color, but we'll see. But I wanna get it back on, then we can start working on the front bash bar tomorrow. So yeah, we'll snap our way through this. We haven't done a snapperooski in a while. Ready, set. All right, bash bar is on, everything lines up, everything fits, our quick latches still work. This one's a little tight, but overall, I'm really happy with how that came out. I knew that was gonna be a struggle trying to adapt this bash bar to this chassis and get everything to line back up, and it was a struggle, but we got it done. It's pretty dang close. Like, for all intents and purposes, it's where it needs to be. So the next step was working on getting the front bash bar on. So we did some measuring. Now this is gonna be pretty critical because in the rear, the frame rails slope down, in the front, they slope up. So matching this and making it level with ride height, the ground, was the tricky part because it's not just an even cut. You can't square it up with the frame rail. So we get it marked as best we can. Then we flip the car around since we're gonna be working on the front and start working on cutting, double checking our measurements. So we get the passenger side frame rail cut off. That one goes pretty smooth, but as we start on the driver's side, I just couldn't get the Sawzall to start straight. It was bouncing around too much, so I took a die grinder and basically scribed a line into the frame rail just to give the Sawzall blade a good, clean, straight place to start. And then, I mean, with the Sawzall, it cuts pretty quick. I mean, it blasts through these frame rails, no problem. So we didn't get them perfect, but we clean them up a little bit with the grinder, and then we come back and trace out our template. So just same process as before. Now when we went to cut it, we had basically just enough room left on this 1/4-inch plate to get both of them. The frame rails are a little taller in the front than they are in the rear, so we're gonna have to do them sideways, and it was gonna be tricky. So we went ahead and cut the plate directly in half first, and then traced out our template on each piece. So again, cutting through this 1/4-inch, man, it takes some time with the bandsaw, and this bandsaw blade has been dull and messed up for a while. And I thought I had some more, and I went to change it before this, but I didn't have any more, so we got to change it later. I ordered some. So this time, instead of using the belt grinder to fully round off the corners from square, I just kind of cut an angle, so it'll be just less work on the belt grinder when we get over there to clean everything up for the final time. So we finished rounding the corners off the second plate, and then we move to the belt grinder. So here we're just rounding off the corners and finalizing basically the general shape. And then I really like to take the time on the belt grinder to really clean everything up, just to smooth out all the hard edges. And it's been amazing running the belt grinder often on material like this to just be able to end up with a really cohesive finished piece. You know, everything's smooth, there's no sharp jagged edges or rough corners. So once we start grinding facing it, that's the worst part, because you're pushing against it with your hand from behind the material against the belt, and if it slips, which it did to me earlier on the rear plates, you punch the belt with your hand, and not fun. So anyway, we get that done. We get them mocked up. We get them tacked in first this time, because since we're not cutting the bash bar off the plates, we needed to hold the bash bar in position and mark the holes. So we did that. We drilled the holes. We got the plates bolted to the bash bar this time so that everything was center. When we do this, we want to try to bolt the plate where it's kind of in the center of the hole so we can move it around. It's not bound up one way or the other. So we do one last little check, make sure it still fits on the car, and we're ready to weld. I need to order some welding wire soon. Hopefully I can make it through this project without it. So I just got these gloves. I'm pretty hyped. So I MIG welded the other bash bar on the back. I had to use my old TIG gloves. So I always hated using MIG gloves because I was so used to TIG gloves, which this is what I use for TIG welding. Like, they're super thin, super light. You gotta have a lot of dexterity. So you go to a MIG glove and they're so big and stiff, but you really need that cowhide on the outside to keep the MIG spatter from burning through. Like, when it lands on the leather part of those gloves, it just burns right through. So anyway, I found these that are a multi-purpose glove. You could probably use them for TIG welding, but I like having more dexterity in this. But they're pretty sick, dude. I'm pretty hyped. It's like a good cross between a MIG and a TIG glove. The ironic part is I ordered them before we started this project, and I didn't think they had come in time, so I welded the whole rear with just regular TIG gloves. And then I went to the door that night and they had been sitting there. They had been delivered like probably before I started doing that, which is kind of funny. Alright, hopefully that's enough. I don't want to weld them out entirely because then probably warp the nut and then the threads will get all messed up. Also, if we didn't weld them enough and if one of these broke off and started spinning, we're kind of SOL because we can't get in there and fix it. So definitely catch-22 there, but just make sure they all unbolt easily, tack them on the car. So before we could go tacking them on the car, there were these little threaded bosses. I'm not even sure what they would be for, probably some little bracket that were in the way of the nuts. That's the difficult thing about welding the nuts on the backside of a plate like this that were fitting real tight in the frame rail, is the nuts kind of seem to get in the way of a lot of stuff. So we get those cut off, we get them ground down so they don't interfere, and then we're ready to position this thing. Now, this was a bit of a struggle doing this as a solo mission. I mean, it was hard enough on the rear with me and Josue, but he wasn't here yet. So trying to get this lined up was a little tricky. Used a strap to pull it tight, used the jack to level it out, and once we were happy with it, decided to go ahead and tack it on. So we'll go through, put a bunch of tacks all around it, all different sides, just to make sure it stays square and doesn't come loose. So with the bash bar pulled off and out of the way, it is time to weld them out. Always a nice feeling when you let the strap loose or jack loose or whatever when you've tacked something on and it stays where it was, you know. It's just, you went from propping it up to it's there. So anyway, we went ahead and MIG welded this out. This is kind of fun. Like I said, I haven't done a lot of MIG welding lately. But compared to TIG, where you're doing all the setup time and everything's gotta be perfect, it's nice to just blast through it. So I went ahead and sweeped up the floor so that way I wasn't laying in metal dust when I got on my back to weld the bottom side. That was definitely the trickiest part. If you lay right under it where you can see it, you're gonna get sparks blasted. I've had them land in my ears, the metal slag, and you hear it burning inside your ear. And I can tell you it's not fun. So I try to kind of stay away from it, but be close enough to see it. So we weld this frame rail out, and then we are done with the front bash bar plates. All right, front bash bar is on, fits good. Really happy with that. Now, if these tabs all line up perfect, kind of remains to be seen, but we really need to get the inner fender arches in, to get the headlights in, to get the fenders on, to test that. So just went ahead and mounted it pretty center. We can make any modifications we need to do that. But at this point, bash bars are on, chassis prep is done. Tunnels cut out, bash bars are welded on, bolted on. Everything fits as it should, everything's lining up. So Josue's doing some rough sanding. We're gonna OSPO them and see how it all looks. Should match the cage. So that'll be a nice sight. So enough jibber jabber, let's get back to it. So the OSPO is actually Josue's thing. I don't know where he learned about it. He told me about it. I didn't have a lot of faith in it, to be honest with you. I was like, do we really need to do that? We can't just grind it down with a wire wheel or something? He used this stuff on the cage, and I was blown away by the results. You know, this bare metal rusts fast. I mean, the cage rusted, you know, started flash rusting in a couple days, and then this stuff's been probably years it's been unpainted. So you basically sand it down, get kind of the rough stuff off, coat it in OSPO. You can see how it's just, the rust is essentially just melting away. So we moved to the front, same deal. Front's just as bad as the rear. Front's a little simpler, obviously. It's not as elaborate of a bash bar, but we get both of those cleaned up, get all that nasty rust off, and we finally get a look at this thing without rusty bash bars and with the bash bars on it. You know, the bare tub with the bash bars. I mean, with this car, they're almost like tube front, tube rear. So it's pretty satisfying. All right, check it out. No more rusty bash bars. They were a little pitted. It's obviously it's not going to get rid of any pitting, but it literally just, the rust falls off. So super cool to see it with, you know, the cage matching the bash bars. Freshly ground frame rails, just nice clean bare metal. Very satisfying. So super stoked to have the bash bars on this thing. It's coming together. We're getting through the main chassis stuff. So we got a little more to do, but what we're gonna do now is go ahead and pressure wash it, because really the next step is gonna be to paint it. So we need to get it cleaned up. So pressure wash it now, give us some time to let it dry. Let's get to it. All right, we got this thing pressure washed, cleaned up. We still got to clean the inside. We didn't want to pressure wash it because there's really nowhere for the water to drain. But all the frame rails and stuff that were dirty and gross and sandy are now clean. So yeah, a little break and then we'll be diving into painting this thing. We need to get the cage primed, the front and rear bars primed, the firewall primed because it's fiberglass, and we should be able to spray this thing, get some color on it. So I hope to see you guys for that. But for now, that's going to be a wrap. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. Goodbye.